Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session with Professor Claire Hughes. I do hope that you're enjoying the festival and saw some of the sessions yesterday, and I hope that you found them fun, interesting, and perhaps from time to time even provocative. I'm always really interested, as is the rest of the team, to hear your feedback, any views that you might have on this particular session, obviously, and also ones that you might see yesterday and ones you're going to see later, but also for ideas for next year's festival. So please do let me know, let us know if you've got any thoughts. Having said that, I ought to introduce myself. I'm Sarah Carthy, I'm the Director of Development here at Newnham, and I'm going to introduce our speaker today, who is Professor Claire Hughes, who matriculated from Newnham in 1986 and read NATSCI, which I understand is the term for natural sciences. Having completed her degree and PhD on the topic of executive function in autism at the University of Cambridge, Claire then moved to Paris for 2 years, working at the Fison Foundation as a postdoctoral research fellow, where she was investigating executive functions in parents and siblings of children with autism. She then returned to the UK and worked for 6 years at the Social, Genetic and Development Psychiatry Research Centre, collaborating with Professor Judy Dunn. Claire then returned to Cambridge and joined the Centre for Family Research. Her research, funded principally by the ESRC, includes a number of longitudinal studies to investigate social and cognitive influences on children's adjustment, and was recognised by a 2011 Women of the Year award. These studies include international collaborations with research partners in Hong Kong, Italy, the USA, and the Netherlands. Claire's first book, Social Understanding, Social Lives, From Toddlerhood to the Transition to School, was published by Psychology Press in 2011, and it won the 2013 BPS Book of the Year award. Together with a former PhD student, Naomi White, Claire has recently written a second book, also published by Psychology Press, which is Why Siblings Matter, the Role of Brother and Sister Relationships in Development and Wellbeing. A book I certainly am going to read for reasons of which one day I might tell you. Claire and I have been working on a project together, and she is one of the best people that you could possibly hope to meet. And her research is infinitely fascinating, and I know that she will talk for 30 minutes with questions afterwards, and I know that you will find it infinitely fascinating, as will I. Thank you very much, and over to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the kind introduction. And hello, everybody. I've chosen the topic of the transition to parenthood, even though it's a relatively new research interest for me, because I think it's something that's of quite general interest. I'm imagining that most of you are parents, and if you're not parents, perhaps you'll be thinking about becoming parents. And just as you'll see, this is an important transition and something that I think we probably all could do with knowing a little bit more about, both so that we can make a more successful transition ourselves, but also that we can support others. I've chosen this image of an actor about to step onto the stage as my kind of opening slide, because I think that to some extent that feeling of butterflies in the stomach, that stage fright that you're about to step onto a public stage, assuming a new identity, you may not have had too many rehearsals. And in the age of social media, there definitely is an audience. All of that kind of trepidation is something that I think new parents do feel. And I think actually those feelings need to be acknowledged in a way that I hope to explain in my talk today. So the field of research on the transition to parenthood is actually very rich and diverse, and it includes all sorts of inspiring stories of people making that transition in unexpected circumstances. So that might be physical or mental disability. It might be gay fathers, for example. These are inspiring tales, but they're not things I'm going to be talking about today. There are also some very topical issues around the rise of obesity and what that can mean for more risky pregnancies. Prematurity is also rising. And of course, there's a lot of people worrying about what the consequences of the pandemic might be for those making that transition. So these are all important questions, but again, not things I'll talk about today, although I might be able to answer a few questions about them if needed. I would include this content note. This has now become good practice when we're giving lectures, just to alert people to the fact that sometimes the images we show could be distressing for some, so that's a little bit of a heads up. So in part, one of the points I'm trying to make in this talk is that tocophobia, which is defined as an extreme fear of giving birth and can be either primary or secondary, depending on whether or not you've had a baby or not. So secondary tocophobia, if you've had a baby, but you never want to do that again because you're so traumatized by it. This is a real thing. The term wasn't defined until about 2000, but world studies have shown that the global prevalence is around 14%. So that's not an insignificant proportion. And in fact, as you can see from this headline here, when Meghan Markle was about to give birth again, there were predictions that all the news coverage around the new baby could actually make a lot of people unhappy. Alongside more general things about birth, there will be a couple of images, and in particular, survivors of the Dutch hunger winter, that I'm going to image because it is actually a really important part of this research field. So I think it's worth putting there. I don't think it's gratuitous, but it might be a distressing image for some. Now, fear of giving birth goes back a very long way. This is a medieval birthing girdle that was made by 15th century monks. And if you look carefully, you can see that there's calligraphy with a prayer that's been inscribed into the birthing girdle that's supposed to kind of protect the woman as she's giving birth. And of course, in medieval times, giving birth was very much more perilous than it is today. It's about the same today in sub-Saharan Africa as it was in medieval England. So the theme of place and time is something that I want to develop in this talk. So as I mentioned, my background, I think of you as being an audience perhaps that vary in ages, and that's why it's important to think about how that transition to parenthood may have changed over time, but also you'll be a very international audience. And so I wanted to acknowledge that the experience could be different in different places. As I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on emotions. So postnatal depression is something everybody will have heard of, I think, PND. You may not have heard of birth trauma, and so that's something I will talk about a little bit. And then I want to focus on prenatal thoughts and feelings and experiences and why they seem to really matter before bringing fathers into the picture, because that's what I was doing in the study that I will be describing at the end of this lecture. And the kind of to steal my own thunder, if you like, the conclusions I want you to come away with is that actually there are really striking similarities in the experiences that mothers and fathers have. It's really not a gender divided experience in the way that it might be often presented or assumed to be in the kind of lay world. Okay, so one of the first points to make in terms of trends over time is that women are having fewer children. Global fertility rates have really dropped over the last 50 odd years. And this is largely a success story. It's not about dropping sperm counts. It's more about women choosing to be educated or choosing a career and therefore not having so many children. That's less a central part of their lives. Having said that, there is global variation in unintended pregnancies, as you can see from this map. So whereas places like Europe and China, unintended pregnancies are very uncommon, sub-Saharan Africa, it's still very, very, very much more common. So you can see that there's global variation in the extent to which people become parents without necessarily intending that. One of the corollaries, if you like, of the drop in fertility rate is that the age at which people are becoming parents has been rising steadily. And this is a global phenomenon. So this graph shows you plots for different countries in Europe. And you can see that over the last 30, 40 years, the mean age of becoming a parent has shifted from around 24, 25 to more like 28, 29. So those few years actually make a real difference because obviously fertility isn't something that stays with us for life. And so if you start becoming a parent later in life, that will be partly why people are having smaller families. It's not just in Europe that you get this transition. And this graph here, that to delay the transition to parenthood, this graph here, I think, shows that it is very much about education. So in the developing world, if you look at the purple lines, those are women with secondary education or higher, and they are becoming parents very much later than their less educated contemporaries. So the drive to women's education is part of the backstory for falling fertility rates. And it's actually affecting women across the age band. So this graph here is showing the fall in teenage births. So the line you can see going down left to right is the drop in conception rates. And the slowly rising bar graphs is a gradual increase in terminations once teenagers become pregnant. So putting it all together, what you can see is that it's now the case that only 2% of births, conceptions are to teenagers, and about 50% of those teenagers will terminate the pregnancy. So it's only about 1% of babies that are born to teen mothers. So it's a very much smaller figure than you might imagine from the media. Okay. And one of the positives that comes out of the changes in the age at which we're becoming parents and our fertility rates more generally is that infant mortality rates have really dropped dramatically over time. So the world figures are shown in green, and then you can see for different income brackets of countries in different colors. And so looking from left to right, what you can see is that there used to be an enormous gap between rich and poor countries in infant mortality, and that gap has narrowed. So that's another success story, that that transition to parenthood is more likely to be successful now than it was historically, in the sense that there's likely to be a live baby, a healthy baby at the end. Having said that, even in the UK, there's some quite worrying variation in infant mortality rates by ethnicity. So in this graph here, you can see that for Pakistani or Black African women, they are 3 or 4 times more likely to suffer from a stillbirth or a baby that doesn't make it through the birthing process than their white mothers or other ethnicities. And there's a complex surrounding factors underpinning this, but it is largely to do with poverty. So all is not rosy in the garden. That there are worrying discrepancies between different ethnic groups in this country. Now, this graph is something that you might not know about, and that is that there is a happiness deficit associated with being a parent. So globally, on average, this graph comes from a study of 22 different OECD countries. And what it showed was that on average, parents are less happy than non-parents. But the size of that gap really depends on the extent to which we as a society support parents. So this is just one measure where we're looking at childcare costs. And if you see right at the end, it goes to 25%. So that means that sending your child to nursery costs on average 25% of the median income, as it does in this country. And there you get really quite a significant gap between parents and non-parents in happiness levels. Whereas if childcare is very much cheaper, say around 6% as it is in the Netherlands, then there is no difference between parents and non-parents in happiness. So as a society, there's a lot we can do to make parents happy, and it is about making that transition to parenthood a whole lot more affordable. One of the reasons that there might be this happiness deficit between parents and non-parents is that parenthood has become a much more intense experience than it used to be. And this is across a range of different countries. So even though people are having fewer children, and even though women are much more likely to be working now when they have children than they might have been 20, 30, 40 years ago, it's still the case that we're spending more time with our children in childcare than the generation before us. And you can see that there are steep increases across a range of countries. France is an interesting bucking the trend. And I'm half French, and I'd be happy to talk about why that might be. You might also note that Denmark, the trend is so extreme that they need a different scale. So this is very much a global trend. I have put boxes around Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States, because these are the 3 countries in the New Fathers and Mothers study that I'll be talking about later. And you can see that across these 3 countries, but perhaps particularly in Britain, there is this intensification of parenthood. Now, I said I'd mention something about postnatal depression. I think most of us have heard of it, but maybe we don't really have an idea of just how serious it can be, because we might think it's just the baby blues, feeling a bit sort of down and ill at sorts, but actually it's more physiological than that. So it could be not being able to sleep even when your baby's sleeping, having poor appetite, guilty and negative thoughts, anhedonia, being unable to enjoy things, all the way through to feeling that life just isn't worth living. And a sad fact is that maternal suicide is the single most common cause of death for new mothers. So it's very much a serious problem that we need to be alive to. What we might not have heard so much about is the fact that alongside PND, other women experience post-traumatic stress disorder. And in fact, a difficult birth is the most common cause of PTSD in this country. And the reason for this is that Other traumas, such as a car accident or being in a natural disaster, having your house flood or something like that, these are terrible things, but they're so out of the ordinary that usually once you're over them, you can kind of close that chapter of your life off and you don't need to think about it anymore. But if you've had a difficult birth and then you have to care for your baby, then every day you're getting a reminder of that difficult birth. And so the flashbacks can be much harder to control. And worryingly, PTSD isn't just associated with medical trauma, although it often is associated with complications, unplanned C-section, difficult births and staying in NICU, but it can also be associated with feeling powerless and not getting proper communication or support during that birthing process. So that suggests that there really is room for improvement. And I think that's been in the news actually in the last week or so. So this is just kind of confirming that. So this is the slide that I said would have some distressing images. It's important to include, though, because it highlights a key point in the literature, which is that whereas historically, as phrases like having a bun in the oven might convey, there was this thought that all the magic is in the seed and the egg, and that the womb is just a kind of safe, warm place for your baby to grow. And so there really wasn't a recognition that what's going on in the woman's life can actually have direct implications for the baby. And that obviously was completely a myth that was torn apart with the thalidomide tragedy, the morning sickness pill that resulted in catastrophic disabilities for thousands of babies. The Dutch hunger winter was when the Nazis laid siege to the Netherlands. And so women across all different social backgrounds were profoundly malnourished. And their babies then went on to show abnormalities in terms of obesity and cardiac problems that have lasted them into their adulthood. But it isn't even malnutrition and toxins that are the end of the story, as the figures you can see from the flood and the ice storm from Quebec. Being in a very stressful experience like a natural disaster can also have implications for toddlers. So we know that when pregnant women get stressed, that actually has a direct impact on the fetus that has enduring consequences for the baby. So it's really important that we understand that the environmental effects begin before birth and that we care for pregnant women accordingly. Having said all of that, clearly the biggest predictor of postnatal depression is whether you were depressed in pregnancy, so what I refer to as antenatal depression. And in a review of the literature, they were able to show that about almost 1 in 2 women with postnatal depression actually were depressed in pregnancy. So if there was greater mental health screening in pregnancy, then we could be putting in the support in place and doing an awful lot to reduce the problem of postnatal depression. I've used this image of a waterfall because I think it helps to explain things. So if the waters are running high before you get to that cascade, then it's going to be much more turbulent when you get to that transition, when you're getting to the waterfall. Whereas if the waters are relatively quiet, then yes, it's going to feel a bit of a jolt making that transition, but it won't be quite the same sort of white water terrifying experience that it might be otherwise. More positively, how we think and feel before pregnancy can also have beneficial effects for the baby. So we now know that bonding with babies begin before birth. And I think for many of us, having had that ultrasound scan, seeing your baby physically moving around makes them more real for you than just seeing those 2 little blue lines and knowing that you're pregnant. Now, obviously, prenatal bonding isn't exactly the same as postnatal bonding. You haven't got a baby that you can really interact with, but it is something that seems to be very closely allied. So it is not uncommon for women to feel like they are parents already, even before they've met their baby. They're thinking it's changing how they're behaving, it's changing what they're eating, it's changing what they're doing with their lives. They are thinking like a parent. And in some recent work as part of the Evidence for Better Lives study, which is a large-scale study involving 8 low and middle-income countries around the world, we recruited more than 1,000 expectant mothers And we gave them, amongst a number of other measures, a survey to get at prenatal attachment. And we were able to show that their ratings were conceptually equivalent across all these really, really different settings. So prenatal attachment isn't just some kind of middle-class Western thing. It's something that has the same meaning across a wide range of countries. The one exception turned out to be Pakistan, and I'd be happy to talk about that later for why things might be slightly different in Pakistan than from these other countries. And in work that I've done with one of my PhD students, Sarah Foley, who was also affiliated to Newnham for a while, and she's now a lecturer at Edinburgh, we did a meta-analysis, so a kind of study in which we pulled data from 14 different studies that we were able to find that straddled the birth of a child, and that included both prenatal interviews or questionnaires about what parents were expecting, and direct video-based observations of the quality of interactions between parents and infants in the first year of life. And what we were able to show across that was that being able to think about your unborn infant as an infant, being able to talk in a kind of coherent way about your unborn infant was a good predictor of postnatal sensitivity. So that suggests that it's really important that antenatal classes, which tend to be very, very narrowly focused on the whole birthing process, should actually be doing more to encourage new parents to think about their baby as an infant and to imagine them and what that relationship is likely to be. And so one approach that you can use is to look at differences in what we call maternal mind-mindedness. So mind-mindedness is the propensity to think about your child as an individual with their own thoughts and feelings. So you look at these images, and I think it's not too hard to tell that some of them are more awake than others, some of them are more happier than others, but being able to tune into that inner world really just means that you are much more likely to interact with them in a sensitive way. So mind-mindedness might be a key driver, if you like, of parental sensitivity. And what's useful about that is that you can actually measure it before birth. So usually with maternal mind-mindedness with infancy, we would record mothers and infants interacting, and we'd look at the way in which mothers are tuning into their babies' thoughts and feelings in how they're talking to them. But you can actually also measure it indirectly by getting parents to talk about their baby. And of course, that's something that you can do before the baby's even born. So this is the instructions that we might use. I'd like to hear your thoughts and feelings about your baby in your own words and without my interrupting. And I'd like you to speak for 5 minutes, telling me what you think you and your baby will be like and how the two of you will get along together. And you usually give parents a bit of a caveat to say that we know that 5 minutes is a long time. This is an odd thing to be asking. If you run dry, that's completely fine. We'll just let you gather your thoughts and start talking again. And usually most parents will. They'll talk for a few minutes, they'll run dry, and then they'll find something else to say. And what we can do is we can transcribe what those speech samples and code them for how mind-minded they are, so whether they're making mentalistic attributes or not. And I'll give you some examples of that later. And this turns out to be a really important thing to be measuring in parents because it predicts the security of infant attachment, and then it predicts a whole host of positive outcomes for children. So being able to better regulate their own thoughts and behaviours, their social understanding, their academic success, and their adjustment. But to date, we don't really know very much about mind-mindedness in the perinatal period or in fathers. So that was one of the sub-goals, if you like, that I had for the new fathers and mothers study that I'll be describing in a moment. Okay, so I said I wanted to bring fathers into the picture. This headline that I put in from Ed Sheeran, which I think was just a week or so ago, fatherhood has made me change my bad habits. I think probably for all men making that transition to parenthood, there are things you start doing differently once you become a dad, but maybe you don't go public with it. And maybe we should go public a little bit more, acknowledging that actually there are things I don't do anymore now that I'm a dad, that it's as much a transition for fathers as it is for mothers. At least that was what I was interested in when we started the study. And this is just to illustrate. So this is the same figure, but for dads. And you can see that rise in amount of time spent in childcare is perhaps not quite as steep, but it's still pretty steep in a number of different countries. Again, kind of flat in France and Slovenia here. France, Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States, which were the three countries in my study, again, you can see this increase over time. So while it's still the case that women do much more childcare than dads, actually dads have really been compared with a generation ago, it's like night and day. That they are very much more involved than they used to be. And unfortunately, along with all of that, is that now that they're no longer kind of aloof and kind of distant from it all, they can be quite emotionally affected by that transition. So in this review by Philpott and colleagues in 2019, they showed that up to 50% of dads showed significant levels of perinatal anxiety that had consequences for their physical and mental health and for their own social relationships and parenting skills. So this is something that is of concern. If we're interested in children, then we need to be interested in the dads as well as the mums. And it was more common amongst less educated and low-income families and families where there was perhaps less social support, or if the mother was herself anxious or depressed. And I think quite worryingly, for dads, being present at a previous birth made them more anxious around that perinatal period. So that's really saying that dads are not getting an awful lot of support around that transition to parenthood. If doing it the second time doesn't make them feel like it'll all be fine, they're actually much more alert to the things that could go wrong. Oops. So I now want to introduce the New Fathers and Mothers study, which, as I said, was an international study. So I want to acknowledge my collaborators in New York, Clancy Blair, and in the Netherlands, Judy Mesman, and Rory Devine was a former student who also helped me on this project. He's now a lecturer in Birmingham. We had 4 different waves. So we saw them at home in the last trimester of pregnancy at 4 months, 14 months, and 24 months. And across these 3 sites, we recruited 460 expectant first-time couples. So 880 plus parents, with about half of them coming from the UK. And the parents completed questionnaires and interviews at each time point, but we also filmed them at 4 months, 14 months, and 24 months. And we gave both the parents and the children cognitive tasks. I'm not going to talk about all of that today, but I'll give you some of the findings that are coming out of that study. So in particular, what I'd like to talk about is the impact of birth experiences, how that matters for mothers and fathers, and how well-being changes over time, whether that's different for mothers and fathers, and then looking at Mymindedness and how that might shift across the perinatal period, and if that's similar for mums and dads. So this is quite a technical diagram. You don't need to pay too much attention to anything other than the red arrows. The mothers are on top, the dads are below. And the important message here is that the correlation between antenatal well-being and postnatal well-being is really strong, 0.42 for mothers and 0.54 for fathers. So there's a lot of stability. So those who are feeling anxious, depressed beforehand are the ones who are feeling anxious, depressed afterwards, as I mentioned. But over and above this, difficult birth experiences were contributing to postnatal well-being. So if you had a C-section or some other kind of difficult birth, you were more likely to be experiencing postnatal depression. And interestingly, for both mums and dads, if you were showing prenatal anxiety or depression, you were more likely to have a difficult birth. So the midwives are right when they kind of tell you to just try and relax and breathe through it all. Looking at the well-being trajectories, what we found was that while there were mean differences for dads with things getting slightly worse, the kind of reality is hitting them. By the time they get to their child's second birthday, they are as likely to be anxious or depressed as their partners, whereas in pregnancy, usually they're feeling much more relaxed about things, and it's the women who are anxious and depressed. But also interestingly, for both women and men, the variability in well-being over that time period, whether you get to feel better or worse over that time period, was really determined by social support. But interestingly, for mothers, the key source of social support was friends, and for fathers, it was family. So social support matters, but perhaps different sources of support matter for mums and for dads. And then coming to the question of consequences, whether this matters for the children, what we were able to show was that prenatal well-being in both mums and dads predicted both externalizing problems, so acting out, throwing tantrums, being a bit oppositional, and internalizing problems, being anxious or fearful. And for the externalizing problems, the kind of acting out, that was a direct link, whereas for the internalizing problems, it was mediated by problems in the couple relationship. So if you're feeling anxious, depressed beforehand, that may have a knock-on effect on your relationship, and your child is tuning into that. So even if we're only primarily interested in children, I'm a developmental psychologist, it's clear that we need to be paying attention to the well-being of parents. So coming last to Mymindedness, this is an excerpt from a speech sample from a dad prenatally. And what I've done is I've underlined the things that I would count as mentalistic. So even without having met this baby, he believes that she likes REM. And he already thinks that she's going to be quite a smart and willful kid. And then there's some other things he's saying that are just sort of positive things. I think she'll be healthy. I think we'll get on quite well. So being Myminded isn't the same as being positive. It's about actually starting to think about the mentalistic characters of your infant. Postnatally, the same dad, he's saying the same sorts of things, that she's quite smart, she's very bright. So these are mentalistic things. That she's very happy, but then there's also just positive things. She's very adorable. She's a lot of fun. She's interactive. She looks like her mother. You can say a lot of really positive things about your child without being mentalistic. So these aren't, it is actually a distinct construct. And when you look at how mind-mindedness changes over time, what you find is that for both mothers and fathers, there is this quite steep increase from prenatal to 4 months. As you imagine, it's much harder to think of your baby as a mental being when you've not even met them yet. And then that continues to grow from 4 months to 14 months as babies become toddlers and start to, show their own thoughts and feelings more directly. And then it kind of plateaus off. And there is a bit of a difference between mums and dads here. And I think that's probably to do with the fact that in this sample, at least, mothers were more likely to be at home and spending time with their toddlers than fathers. And then in terms of what the Mymindedness might mean for children, what we found was that whereas postnatal Mymindedness was related to standard measures of sensitivity, so that's being prompt, appropriate, and consistent in how you're responding to your child's cues, the prenatal Mymindedness wasn't, but it was related to some of the more sophisticated and cognitive aspects of parents' interactions. So we have this little Lena device, this recording thing. It's about the size of a small phone, and the child wears it in a tabard. You can see that baby with a little octopus tabard. That's a special thing for putting the Lena thing in. And it's like a talk pedometer. We connect it to our computers at the end of the day, and it will give us a readout for how much talk the infant has received from female voices and male voices. But also importantly, it picks up on the temporal contiguity, so it can tell whether the talk is responsive to baby babble, whether it's contingent talk in that way or whether it's just being talked at, which is obviously less useful than some kind of contingent talk. And what we found was that for mums, prenatal Mymindedness was related to their contingent talk at 6 months, wasn't for dads, but for dads, it was related to their ability to support their toddler's autonomy at 14 months. So they were better able to help their toddlers to solve a puzzle by themselves, if they'd been thinking about their baby in a kind of mentalistic way before they were born. So these are good developmental outcomes for children, and suggest that it really is important to help expectant parents to be thinking about their babies as kind of humans with thoughts and feelings. So just to wrap up, what I hope you can get from my talk today is that there's some quite striking similarities between mums and dads. You'd think that giving birth was the thing that divided men and women more than anything else. But it turns out that emotionally, actually, the experience is really quite similar. And the consequences of prenatal and postnatal well-being for their children is really quite similar for mums and for dads. And mums and dads also show a pretty similar increase in Mymindedness. So there are some subtle differences in terms of, for example, the sources of what's salient in terms of sources of social support, and perhaps in what particular aspects of parenting are related to Mymindedness. But broadly, if I wanted you to have a take-home message, is that mums and dads are becoming parents together and going through really quite similar experiences. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping that you'll have some questions for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. That was amazing. And as a mother of a 26-year-old, quite a lot of that rang very, very true. While we wait for questions to come through the chat, and if there are any men on the call, that we'd really like to hear your views, if you're willing to put them forward. But in the meantime, perhaps I can ask Claire a sort of a very wide-ranging question, which is that Given that your mention of maternity wards and the problems that NHS hospitals seem to be having with maternity quality these days, if there was a magic wand, what one thing do you think the NHS should change or could be changed to make things improve considerably over the next six months or a year?
So I think that starting early, so putting in interventions before people become parents, giving them more support than they do, so that I know that there are antenatal classes you can have on the NHS, but they're really very much about birth and what, forceps delivery and all of these sorts of things. So actually doing a little bit of preparing people for parenthood early would be useful. I also think that it's a great window of opportunity, because once the baby is born, not only are parents a whole lot busier, and so actually physically getting along to these things might be a lot harder, although of course in today's age of Zoom, maybe that's less of an issue. But there's also potentially a bit of a stigma about asking for help once you've got a child. It's almost like acknowledging that things aren't working as well as you'd hoped. Whereas if the classes are made available before your baby is born, then you can rock up and feel quite smug about the fact that you're doing the right thing in getting prepared. And so you can have the best intervention in the world, but if you don't get parents to turn up for it, then it doesn't work. That's often the limiting factor, is whether you can get parents to engage with these things. And so doing it early, I think, would be really useful. But more generally as well, I think being more aware that it's not just a fetus, that there is a woman carrying this baby. So I'm in some interesting conversations at the moment with people in clinical medicine, where they're talking about their treatment for gestational diabetes and how there's a lot of measuring the baby's growth, and they're not necessarily thinking about what all of this extra measurement might be doing in terms of making the mothers more anxious and affecting their own kind of well-being. So beginning early and recognizing the kind of mental and emotional component of parenthood would be the two things I would say.
Thank you. A couple of questions have come through. We have an anonymous attendee that asks, are there any preventative steps that potential mothers and fathers can begin to take before they even start having children?
Yes. So when I was making that transition, so I joke sometimes with my students that I give a lecture where we talk about fetal alcohol syndrome, which is much more prevalent than you'd think it might be. And my joke is that it's quite hard to conceive sometimes without a bit of alcohol. But actually, if you want to become a parent, then swapping the alcohol for the folic acid would be a really useful thing to do. But then, of course, you've also got to somehow make the magic happen without the alcohol. But getting more experience, I mean, because we are smaller families now and we're geographically more dispersed, it is the case that you might hand a newborn to an adult and they look petrified because they've not held a baby before. So spending some time with babies, volunteering to do a bit of babysitting, just tuning in so that you can get better at recognizing a baby's cry. Is that cry just because they're tired, or are they hungry? All of those sorts of things takes time, and you can prep for that because most babies have the same sorts of signals. Obviously, your baby will be slightly different. But yeah, there's expertise that I think that in the days of larger families, we would have had. If you were one of the older children in a family, you'd have been looking after younger siblings. If you're one of the younger ones, you might have been an aunt or an uncle. And we tend to be coming to this relatively unprepared. So yes, there's definitely things you can do before you even get pregnant.
Thank you. One of the next questions, they're all coming in thick and fast now, you're pleased to know. Anonymous question, says some very interesting numbers there. The one that stood out to me was a decrease in happiness overall for parents, and yet you never hear parents say they regret having kids. Why do you think that is?
Absolutely. I really think it's an interesting thing. I think happiness isn't the end all and be all of things. I think parents probably think their life is much more meaningful, that you might not get the kind of highs that you might get from going to the pub or the cinema or whatever, that there's a lot of exhaustion that comes with it, but you genuinely feel that you matter to another being, and you know that, and that you're your life has a sense of purpose that it might not have otherwise. So happiness isn't everything. But also, I do think alongside that happiness deficit, I think I could have shown you more graphs with different measures. But when societies support parents, that deficit disappears. So it's not an inevitable. It's really just about how hard it is to become a parent in a world that isn't necessarily particularly supportive of parents.
And going on from that, a sort of a linked question, which says you talked about the importance of support from friends for the mother and from family for the father. Did you look at what sorts of support were most beneficial in each case?
We haven't yet. I think we just asked them to identify those sources of support. But in our interviews, the sorts of things that mothers would say to us is that they might be, if they were doing a night feed, they might be on a WhatsApp group because they knew that other mothers were likely to be up, and just having something, some little bit of company when you're feeling all kind of alone at night. I think it's that shared experience that friends can bring. And oftentimes you do change your friendship group a little bit in those early years. You might gravitate to other people who've got more common experiences. I thought it was interesting that we didn't get that friendship effect for dads. And I don't know whether that's because it's still not quite okay to talk about the things that matter and the intimacy and the feelings of being depressed or anxious as a dad. I know that there are groups where they play football, they go to the pub, and then they talk about what it's like to be a dad. There has to be some sort of reason for getting together other than just we are dads. And you know, maybe in 10 years that will have completely changed again.
Again, linking into that, Josephine asks, is there any research on mental health depending on age of transition to parenthood?
Typically, the younger mothers are more likely to be experiencing poor mental health. As a general rule, I would say that shift in the age of transition is interesting, because if you give birth out of line with your peer group, either much sooner or much later than your peers, then there can be feelings of isolation. And you do see that oftentimes friendship groups, when one of them has a baby, then suddenly their friends all start to think this might be the right time. But it may also literally be the right time, because then they know that they can hold on to that friendship and they can go through this kind of really important experience together.
Which links nicely to the next question about linking and being with people. And it's an anonymous question again. Do you think the pandemic has affected these environmental stresses? Do you think the pandemic has affected these environmental stresses potential parents, new parents have been under, and how might we mitigate this? Sorry, I mangled that slightly, yeah. But I hope it comes through.
Absolutely, but it turns out that the effects are much more complex than you might imagine. So clearly it's been really, really difficult for women who are hoping to do lots of postnatal groups, meeting other mothers, forming those sorts of supportive networks, and having to do all this in isolation. I mean, on Zoom is just not the same as physically being in a room with other people going through the same thing. On the other side of it, though, for fathers, they may have been much more likely to be working from home and actually getting the kind of paternity leave that perhaps they wouldn't have been able to otherwise have. And so for some families, this will have been a kind of treasured baby moon experience where they didn't feel obliged to take the baby to meet Uncle Tom Cobley and all, and they could just focus on their own little family unit and spend time together. And that will have been really precious time. So it isn't inevitable that it's been a really difficult experience for everybody, but that's not to say that it hasn't been very, very difficult for some.
And I think we've just got time for one last question, and which would be, is there a strong link between anxiety experienced for many years since childhood and postnatal depression? And what steps would you advise to assist with that if you want to have a family?
Strangely not. I mean, there is a link in our sample, but actually we had in our sample people who had pre-pregnancy problems of anxiety and depression, and they weren't necessarily the ones that showed the most postnatal depression or anxiety. there are physiological things that affect your well-being in pregnancy and in the postnatal period. So it isn't as straightforward as that. But I think there's something I perhaps should have put in my talk and I didn't, which is that if you are on antidepressants, a lot of times parents might feel like, well, I'll have to come off the antidepressants in order to be pregnant because that will be damaging to my baby. Well, if you talk to your GP, you might find that actually they recommend that you stay on the antidepressants because the effects of that medication may be very much more minor than the effect of actually being depressed in pregnancy. So I wouldn't worry about it too much.
I'm just going to ask one last question, which is, playing Mozart to your baby while it's in the womb, does that really help create a more intelligent child?
Who knows? If you enjoy Mozart, then playing Mozart to your baby probably makes you feel calm and perhaps gives you an opportunity to reflect and think about your baby. We do know that the baby's auditory system is fully developed by 5 months. We do know that some learning happens in the womb, but that's not to say that they're going to be more intelligent per se. No, I think there's probably a lot of hype around that.
Righty-ho. Well, that just leaves me to thank Professor Claire Hughes for an extremely interesting presentation. And we look forward to perhaps next year we come and do Why Siblings Matter, the role of brother and sister relationships in development and well-being, which would be equally as fascinating. Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, audience. I do hope you enjoyed it. Please do let us have some feedback and hopefully see you next year when we can do all this lovely thing together. Enjoy the football. See you soon. Bye-bye.